Hello, Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother, and I am here today with a Friday Reads video because it's Friday, so it's time for Friday Reads. So I finished 3 books this past week, and I am currently reading 4 books, so I'd like to share those with you. So I'm very excited because I had 2 5-star reads this week. Oh my gosh! I don't even know if I've had 2 5-star reads in a single week before, so I feel like I've now hit the pinnacle and it's just all going to be downhill from here. Just kidding, hopefully. But yeah, definitely an unusual occurrence, so I'm very pleased about that. And the first of my 2 5-star reads is Toni Morrison's Beloved. This was a reread for me. This is probably the 3rd time I've read this book. But it'd been several years, and so even though I remembered some basic plot points, you know, and I remembered, you know, mostly what happens in this book, you know, some of the specifics I was a little hazy on. And I think I mentioned last week that I am part of a project at my school that the English department is running about Toni Morrison's Beloved, and so they're encouraging us to teach it in as many of our classes as we can manage, and they're gonna do a number of activities associated with the book. Guest lecturers, of course, it's going to be virtual now and things of that sort. But yeah, so it was good for me to go ahead and reread this so I could start thinking about how I will teach it next month, because oh my gosh, we're almost a month, only a month away from starting the fall semester. I can't believe it. So anyway, Beloved is the novel that won Toni Morrison the Nobel Prize in Literature. Fun fact, Toni Morrison remains the first and only African-American, man or woman, to have received the honor of the Nobel Prize in Literature. So this is the story of Setha, who is a formerly enslaved woman who now lives with her daughter Denver in a house that is called 124 in Ohio. I think it's Cincinnati, somewhere in Cincinnati. And the house is haunted. That's not a spoiler. You find that out like literally at the beginning of the book. So the house is haunted. And it's haunted by a baby ghost, one of Setha's children who died as a baby. And so near the beginning of the book, this man, Paul D., whom Setha had known during her enslavement, Paul D. was also enslaved on the same plantation where Setha was, which is a plantation ironically called Sweet Home in Kentucky. So he comes to pay her a visit, and he seemingly exorcises the house of the ghost, and it seems like after that possibly he and Setha will begin a romantic relationship, and that maybe, you know, Paul D. and Setha's daughter Denver will become sort of like a family. And then this strange woman who is, you know, maybe 19 or 20 years old shows up one day, and she calls herself Beloved. And then the story just kind of takes off from there, and slowly you come to learn things about what happened on the Sweet Home plantation, what happened to Setha's child who died and is haunting the house, etc., etc. The language in this is... Oh, I'll also say about this book, it's not an easy book to read. It is a bit challenging structurally because it's told in a non-linear fashion. So the story jumps back and forth in time. A lot of times you have a character, especially Setha or Paul D., who's, you know, doing something at the present moment, and then that causes them to reflect back on something that happened when they were at the Sweet Home plantation during their enslavement. And it also will sometimes change verb tense. And it almost seems random, but it's really not. And I think Morrison is doing this absolutely on purpose because she's trying to show the fragmentary nature of our memory, and she's also trying to show the effects of trauma and post-traumatic stress in a way that, you know, you could be doing something in the present moment, and because of a previous trauma that you've experienced, you suddenly, you know, freeze up and have this, you know, dramatic and/slash traumatic flashback to something else. So I think the change is intense. are also meant to be reflective of that. This also has a good number of biblical allusions in the text. Those don't necessarily play, like, I don't think it's necessary for you to understand them all to get something out of this, but I do think that it's interesting. For example, there are several chapters around the middle or so of the book that start off with the phrase, I am, wait, I'm actually going to find it, so just hang tight. So they all start off with something to do with beloved, and one of them starts off with, I am beloved and she is mine, which is a reference to Song of Songs. So I also thought that was interesting that and there's also some other biblical references that occur in here. But yeah, it's a gorgeously written novel. It's very poetic. It's full of rich and vivid imagery, some of which is very jarring and upsetting because it's a book that's about how slavery haunts us. So yeah, it's 100% worthwhile reading if you've never read it. And it's a book that I think benefits from rereading because the first time you read it, you're kind of trying to figure out what exactly is going on. Personally, I feel like it doesn't get too confusing until part 2. I think it stays pretty, it's pretty straightforward up until about part 2, and then you start having some things that you're like, I'm not totally sure what's happening. But just stick with it. It's totally worthwhile. And yeah, I just think everyone should read this. It's wonderful. 5 stars. The next book I finished this week was Michio Kaku's Physics of the Impossible. So this is a book that pretty much takes concepts from science fiction novels, TV shows, and movies and talks about, from an actual standpoint of physics, how actually possible they are within certain time frames. So Kaku has 3 different classifications. So he has class 1 impossibilities, class 2 impossibilities, and class 3 impossibilities. So class 1 impossibilities cover things like force fields and teleportation and antimatter and psychokinesis and some other things. So those are things that he thinks do not violate the known laws of physics and will be possible within the next century or so. Although I will say that a lot of the things that he discusses as class 1 impossibilities, you find out they're possible or they're already being worked on at a microscopic or subatomic level, but they're not going to be possible at a macroscopic level. So they really sort of turn into a class 2 impossibility. Like there's no way we're going to actually perfect teleportation of full, items, including humans or, animals or even like an apple in our lifetime. So that I kind of felt was a little misleading because he's like, yes, teleportation's totally possible within the next 100 years, except it's totally not if you're thinking of it from a Star Trek standpoint. Pardon me, the dog is upset. I will be right back. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Char was upset because my parents were outside doing something and she thought that meant we were leaving. Alright. So, so the class 2 impossibilities are things that also do not violate the known laws of physics, but are not going to be achievable within 100 years. They probably won't be achievable until like 1,000 years. 1,000 or more years. So those include things like time travel. I know, weird. Time travel doesn't violate the known laws of physics. Who knew? Going faster than the speed of light, and parallel universes. Oh boy, string theory is fun. And then class 3 impossibilities are things that are either actually really impossible or in order for them to become possible, our fundamental understanding of the laws of physics would have to radically shift. So that includes perpetual motion machines and precognition. So yes, I found this book engagingly written. I think Kaku does a pretty good job of breaking down or simplifying complex scientific topics to discuss with a general readership, although I'm not really a very science-minded person, so I still really didn't understand everything that was discussed, but I felt like he did do a pretty good job of trying to break it down so that it would be understandable. And yeah, it was good. 3.5 stars. I would recommend it, especially if you're into science and physics and you already, well, actually, if you already know some about physics, you might find this tedious. But you know, if you're interested in this topic of how possible are these things within a certain time frame and the explanations of why they do or do not violate the known laws of physics, then I would recommend this book. So yeah, 3.5 stars. My other 5-star read this week was Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. So I had not read Kazuo Ishiguro before, and Kazuo Ishiguro actually won the Nobel Prize in Literature in, I think, 2017. So with my reading of Toni Morrison's Beloved and my reading of this book by Kazuo Ishiguro, both of whom are Nobel Prize winners in literature, I have now completed my summer school readathon prompt of language arts. And actually with the Kaku book, Physics of the Impossible, I've completed my summer school readathon prompt for science because I actually snuck in one of my science-related books at the very tail end of June, which was Brandon Taylor's Real Life, which is about a guy who is studying biochemistry, and it definitely has a lot of science references in it. So between that book and Physics of the Impossible, I'm like, boom, I have science covered. So I've now knocked language arts and science off the list. So yeah, but anyway, so The Remains of the Day is focused on a butler in post-World War II England. So the entire story is told from this butler's perspective. He has worked at this estate called Darlington Hall for 30 plus years. At the opening of the novel, the estate of Darlington Hall has been taken over within the last year or so by an American man named Mr. Faraday. And we see the butler, whose name is Stevens, by the way, we see Stevens sort of struggle a little bit with how to relate to his American employer, and he wants to do everything just right, but he has a lot of hang-ups about what his relationship to his employer should be like, because he's very focused on propriety and dignity and proper relationships between a butler and the lord of the house, right, or the master of the house. And so at the beginning of the book, we see him sort of angst. We see Stevens angst a lot about how Mr. Faraday seems to want him, or seems to expect him to banter with him at various points of the day, and Stevens is not really sure how he should respond to this. So that's sort of comical. And anyway, so at the beginning of the book, Faraday says that he's going to go away for a while, and he tells Stevens, you've never taken a vacation. Why don't you just go and, travel through the English countryside and enjoy it? And, I'll foot the bill. It's fine. Go have a vacation. So at first he's kind of thinking, I shouldn't do that. It's not really proper. But then he decides that he will do it, especially because there is a former employee of Darlington Hall who lives, I don't remember where she lives now, but it's somewhere else in England. So he thinks, oh, well, that would be great. I could go visit her, and maybe I can convince her to come back and work at Darlington Hall again, because there are a lot less staff, or a lot fewer staff that are working there since Faraday took over than there were under his previous employer, Lord Darlington. So anyway, so he sets off on his trip, and you do see him, you do see actually what his trip is like, and he talks about the countryside, and he describes various encounters with people during his travels. But mostly this book is focused on Stevens's recollections of Darlington Hall, his relationship to his father, who also worked at Darlington Hall until he died, his relationship with Lord Darlington, and his relationship with Miss Kenton, who is the woman that he's going to go visit. And I can't really explain why this book is so good or so compelling. I think it's part of the reason is because I was just so sucked into the character of Stevens. He is portrayed so vividly. The character is just spot on. He talks in this very formal way that you would imagine a repressed butler who's, you know, been buttling for 30 plus years in England would talk. And the thing of it is that this book is really more, like, you should really focus more on the things that are not said than the things that are said, if that makes sense. Because Stevens is the kind of person who will nitpick over small details, but he'll miss the bigger picture. And y'all, this book made me ugly cry at the end. Like, I was bawling. And I don't even remember the last time that a book made me cry like that. But yeah, I was already thinking it was gonna be like a 4-star read, but when I got to the end, that just pushed me over the edge, and I was like, oh my god, 5 stars. I don't even know when the last time was that I ugly cried over a book. So, I don't think this is gonna be a book for everyone, but it's a very rich, very vividly portrayed character study of this butler, and I just thought it was so good and so compelling, and again, I ugly cried. So I really recommend it. 5 stars. Alright, so that is it for the books that I finished this week. So now on to what I'm currently reading. So I started 2 books this week, and this is for the Common Core part of the Summer School Readathon prompts. So I started William Maxwell's novel, They Came Like Swallows. Yeah, that's it. They Came Like Swallows. This was published in, I think, 1937 or 38. It is set during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. So I'm like a third of the way into this right now. So far I've seen 8-year-old Peter Morrison, whose nickname is Bunny, so he's referred to as Bunny. And you sort of see his life with his older brother Robert, who's I think 13, and his mother and father, and they live in a small town in Illinois. And you sort of see the dynamics of the family and their relationships to each other through Bunny's eyes. He thinks very highly of his mother. He's very dependent on her, possibly too dependent because, you know, he's 8 and he's still a child, right? But he's you know, starting to get to the point where maybe he shouldn't be quite so dependent on his mother, but she's like his whole world. And yeah, so it's pretty much kind of set the scene so far. And again, this is set during the Spanish flu epidemic because that's already been referenced. So I'm curious to see where the story will go from here. So this is the fiction book that I picked for the Common Core prompt, which is to pair a related fiction and nonfiction book. And then the nonfiction book I'm reading alongside it is Frank Kermode's The Sense of an Ending, Studies in the Theory of Fiction. This was published in, I think, 1965, maybe, and it was originally given as a series of lectures at Bryn Mawr. And there are 6 lectures, and basically Kermode is thinking about apocalypse in fiction, and what our view is of the apocalypse, why we need to keep having apocalypse or have an idea that the end is near. And I've read the first 2 lectures, so I'm trying to read this book and They Came Like Swallows at roughly the same rate so that I can actually sort of see them together. So I've read the first 2 lectures in this, so I'm basically about a third of the way in both of these books right now. And yeah, so the first 2 lectures are basically about how throughout recorded history, people have pretty much thought that the end was near. And when, you know, there's been a date set for the world is going to end by, you know, such and such a date, and then that date comes and the world doesn't end, then, you know, people push it back off and say, okay, well, you know, we were wrong about this, but it's definitely going to end this day, right? And so why we have this sort of psychological need to keep thinking that we're living in the end of days, pretty much, and how that relates to fiction. So, yeah, so I'm a third of the way through this, so we'll see how well or not this actually does match up with this book about the Spanish flu epidemic, which I would think would be sort of apocalyptic. So, alright, and then I'm also still reading with my friend Taylor, Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady. We are a little bit over halfway through this, still enjoying it. Some intrigue has happened in our last section of reading, so I'm curious to see how that is going to play out. And I don't really want to say too much more about it because otherwise that would be spoilery, but I'm still enjoying our discussions about this. And I'm also still doing my buddy read with Lindsay of Lindsay's Book Life of The Red Tent by Anita Diamant. This is a retelling of the biblical story of Dinah. So the first section of the book talks about Dinah's mother. So her mother is Leah, who is married to Jacob, and Leah's sisters, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, are also married to Jacob. And so between the four of them, they father 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel, and Dinah is the only girl. So far we've seen some stuff about the mother stories. We've also seen, we're now in a section from Dinah's perspective, and they've left the land of Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah's father, Laban, and now they're traveling back to Jacob's ancestral homeland of Canaan. So yeah, it's good. We're about 150 pages in, which is a little, I think, under halfway. But I'm enjoying how this takes biblical figures and tropes and sort of gives them new life and gives a feminist perspective to everything by centering the women's stories, which is not often done. So I am still enjoying our read of this. So that is all. This has probably gone on for too long at this point, so I'm going to wrap it up. But those are the books that I finished this week or I'm currently reading. I would love to hear what you have been reading and enjoying lately. Let me know if you've read any of these books or have thoughts about any of them down in the comments below. I hope you're all staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?